5 true unnerving horror stories. Story well. The Phantom Caller. In 2013, Sarah, a college student living in a small apartment, began receiving mysterious phone calls. Initially, she thought they were prank calls. The caller would never speak, only breathing heavily or sometimes playing eerie, distorted music. Despite changing her number multiple times, the calls persisted. One night, while studying late, Sarah received another call. This time, she answered it on speakerphone. The caller remained silent, but Sarah felt a sudden chill as if she were being watched. She glanced at her window and saw a shadowy figure standing outside. Panicked, she called the police, but the figure vanished before they arrived. The police couldn't find any evidence of an intruder, and the calls continued. Sarah began to notice other strange occurrences, objects moving around her apartment, doors she knew she had locked being found open, and the feeling of being watched even when she was alone. She installed security cameras, hoping to catch the stalker. Reviewing the footage one morning, Sarah was horrified to see the shadowy figure standing over her bed while she slept. The intruder wore a mask and seemed to know where all the cameras were, as he avoided looking directly at them. Sarah showed the footage to the police, who launched a full investigation. It was later discovered that the intruder was a maintenance worker with access to her apartment. He had been stalking her for months, using his job to gain entry. The police arrested him, and Sarah moved out immediately. Though she was physically safe, the psychological scars remained, and she never felt entirely secure again. Story 2. The Basement Secret. In 2005, Mark and Linda bought their dream home, an old Victorian house in a quiet neighbourhood. The house was perfect except for one thing: a locked door in the basement. The previous owner claimed he had lost the key and assured them it was just a storage room. Curious, Mark and Linda decided to hire a locksmith to open the door. What they found inside was far from ordinary. The room was filled with old medical equipment, including an operating table and various surgical tools. The walls were lined with shelves containing jars of preserved organs and other unsettling items. Disturbed, they contacted the police, who conducted a thorough investigation. It turned out that the previous owner, Dr. Harrison, was a disgraced surgeon who had lost his license due to unethical practices. The room was his secret operating theatre, where he performed illegal surgeries. The police found evidence linking Dr. Harrison to several missing persons cases, and he was arrested. Mark and Linda tried to move on, but the knowledge of what had happened in their home haunted them. They began hearing strange noises from the basement at night: footsteps, whispers, and the sound of metal clinking. Despite trying to renovate the basement and turn it into a normal room, the disturbances continued. Eventually, they decided to sell the house and move away. To this day, they believe the spirits of Dr. Harrison's victims lingered in the basement, unwilling to let go of their tragic past. Story 3. The Disappearing Neighbour. In 2010, Emily moved into a new apartment complex in a bustling city. She quickly befriended her next-door neighbour, Rachel, a quiet woman who seemed to keep to herself. They would occasionally chat in the hallway, and Emily often saw Rachel leaving for work early in the morning and returning late at night. One evening, Emily heard a loud argument coming from Rachel's apartment, followed by a sudden silence. Concerned, she knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She didn't see Rachel for several days after that, and her mail began to pile up. Worried, Emily contacted the building manager, who opened Rachel's apartment. The apartment was empty, and there were no signs of a struggle. It was as if Rachel had vanished into thin air. The police were called, but there were no leads, and Rachel was eventually declared a missing person. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. Months passed, and Emily began to notice strange things happening in her own apartment. Furniture moved, items went missing, and she felt a constant sense of being watched. One night, she woke up to find Rachel standing at the foot of her bed, looking gaunt and terrified. Rachel whispered, "Help me," before disappearing. Emily was convinced Rachel's ghost was trying to communicate with her. She hired a private investigator who discovered that Rachel had been involved in a dangerous relationship with a man who had a history of violence. The investigator found evidence that Rachel had been abducted and likely murdered, but her body was never found. Emily moved out of the apartment, but she never forgot Rachel. She still feels a connection to her, believing that Rachel's spirit is seeking justice and story for a hotel room. In 2018, James, a travelling salesman, checked into a historic hotel in a small town. The hotel was charming, but had a reputation for being haunted. James, a skeptic, dismissed the stories and settled into his room for the night. Around midnight, James was awakened by a loud knocking on his door. He opened it to find an empty hallway. Assuming it was a prank, he returned to bed, only to hear the knocking again, this time louder and more insistent. Frustrated, he called the front desk, but they assured him no one had been on his floor. The disturbances continued throughout the night, knocking, whispers, and the sound of furniture moving. James tried to ignore it, but when his bed suddenly shook violently, he decided he had enough. He packed his bags and went to the lobby, demanding a new room. The hotel staff, seeing his distress, offered him a different room and explained that the room he had been in was notorious for paranormal activity. Years ago, a guest had been found dead under mysterious circumstances, and since then, other guests had reported similar experiences. James spent the rest of the night in the lobby, too scared to sleep. He checked out early the next morning and vowed never to return. Despite his skepticism, the experience left him deeply unsettled. He later learned that many guests who stayed in that room reported similar encounters, leading him to believe that something truly paranormal was at play. Story 5: The Ghost of the Abandoned House. In 2016, a group of friends decided to explore an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The house had been empty for decades and was rumoured to be haunted by the ghost of a woman who had died there under tragic circumstances. The friends entered the house just before dusk, armed with flashlights and cameras. They wandered through the dusty rooms, joking about the ghost stories they had heard. As night fell, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. They began to hear faint cries and footsteps echoing through the empty halls. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, they found a locked trunk. Curiosity piqued. They forced it open and discovered old photographs, letters, and a diary belonging to a woman named Margaret. The diary detailed her abusive marriage and her eventual decision to take her own life to escape her tormentor. As they read Margaret's heartbreaking story, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. One of the friends saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner, watching them. The figure began to move closer, and the friends fled the house in terror, leaving the diary and photographs behind. Later, they researched Margaret's story and found records of her tragic death. Her husband had been a cruel and controlling man, and Margaret had indeed died in the house. The friends believe that Margaret's spirit was still trapped in the house, reliving her pain and seeking closure. The experience left them shaken and convinced that some places are haunted by more than just memories. They vowed never to return to the abandoned house, and the story of their encounter became a local legend,